What if God needs us? It's a question that's haunted humanity for as long as we've been asking questions. A question that whispers in the quiet moments, in the face of overwhelming sorrow, or even in the midst of incredible joy. It's a question that pulls at something deep inside us, a sense of responsibility, perhaps, or maybe just a profound feeling of loneliness. We build our lives around beliefs, around faiths, around the idea of a higher power. But what if those beliefs aren't truly needed? What if the very existence of God depends on our continued engagement, on our continued struggle with the things that make us human? Think about the story of Cain and Abel. The Bible tells us that God favored Abel. Cain, consumed by jealousy, murdered his brother. Was this an act of pure malice? Perhaps. But the story also suggests a consequence, a distortion of the divine order because of Cain's reaction. What if God didn't want Cain's jealousy to exist? What if God's entire plan, God's very being, was somehow intertwined with the balance between love and resentment, between generosity and greed? Consider the rise and fall of Rome. An empire built on conquest, on law, on an almost unbelievable sense of order. They believed in their gods, in their rituals, in their destiny. Yet despite their power, their military might, they crumbled. Was it simply bad luck? Was it a natural cycle of empires? Or was it something more? A lack of constant, unwavering faith, a letting go of the very principles that sustained their belief? What if the strength of Rome wasn't in its legions, but in the collective prayers of its people? Look at the Crusades. Centuries of bloodshed, fueled by religious fervor. Knights charging into battle, driven by the promise of salvation, often ignoring the pleas of the people they were meant to protect. What if God wasn't interested in grand displays of violence? What if God was wounded by the sheer scale of human cruelty, by the deliberate twisting of faith into a justification for war? What if the pursuit of God actually created the need for conflict? Think about the Renaissance. A rebirth of art, of science, of human potential. People began to question old certainties, to explore new ideas. They rediscovered classical learning, challenging the authority of the church. But did this questioning necessarily diminish God? Or did it, in fact, demonstrate God's own desire for humanity to think for itself, to grapple with its own existence? What if God's greatest gift to us was not blind obedience, but the capacity to doubt? Consider the history of addiction. People reaching out for comfort, for escape, in substances that ultimately destroy them and those around them. Addiction isn't just a personal failing, it's a desperate plea for something to fill a void. What if God wasn't a distant judge, dispensing rewards and punishments, but a compassionate healer, yearning to mend broken hearts and restore lost souls? What if God needed us to acknowledge our suffering, to confront our weaknesses, to actively seek redemption? Look at the rise of totalitarian regimes. Leaders who demanded absolute loyalty, who suppressed dissent, who manipulated people's fears. They claimed to represent God, to speak in His name. But were they truly serving God, or were they simply exploiting faith for their own power? What if God actively resisted such distortions, if God's presence was always threatened by the abuse of religious authority? What if God required us to constantly challenge those who claim to speak for Him? Think about the countless acts of kindness, of selfless sacrifice, that have occurred throughout history. People helping strangers, risking their lives for others, simply because they believe in something bigger than themselves. These acts aren't necessarily proof of God's existence. But they do suggest a fundamental human need for connection, for compassion, for a sense of belonging. What if God wasn't a solitary creator, but a being who thrives on the bonds between us, on the shared experiences of love and empathy? What if God's very essence is the collective good? Consider the beauty of the natural world. The intricate patterns of a snowflake, the soaring flight of a bird, the vastness of the ocean. These things inspire awe and wonder, but they don't necessarily prove the existence of a divine hand. Yet they do prompt us to ask, why? Why this beauty, this complexity, this apparent order? What if God isn't a distant architect, designing the universe from afar, but a participant in its unfolding, a being who finds joy in the simple miracle of existence? What if God needs us to appreciate the wonder around us? Look at the phenomenon of grief. The overwhelming pain of loss, the desperate need to find meaning in suffering. People turn to religion, to spirituality, to find comfort and hope. But what if God wasn't a being who could erase pain, but a being who understood it, who shared it, who offered solace not through denial, but through the shared experience of sorrow? What if God needed us to feel the full weight of our emotions, to confront our mortality, to find strength in vulnerability? Think about the power of art. Music, painting, literature, they allow us to express our deepest emotions, to explore our most profound questions. They connect us to something beyond ourselves, something timeless and universal. What if God isn't a distant observer, but a fellow artist, responding to the creative impulses of humanity, shaping our world through our dreams and aspirations? What if God needs us to create? Consider the simple act of conversation. Sharing our thoughts and feelings with another person, listening to their perspective, engaging in a genuine exchange of ideas. These interactions build relationships, foster understanding, and strengthen our sense of community. What if God isn't a lonely deity, but a being who thrives on connection, on the shared experience of consciousness? What if God needs us to talk? The weight of this question, this unsettling possibility, settles upon us. It's a question that demands humility, that challenges our assumptions, that forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that perhaps our beliefs